let's start there. We'll lay out the problem, right? There's no question that the rules of policing, or perhaps better say the goals of policing, are informed in many ways by a political cycle that is, in this country at its longest, 6-year terms, right? And that's if you're running for Senate. And since we're generally talking about municipal level type of offices or state level offices when we're talking about police, you're generally talking about a 4-year election cycle. And political questions handled in that sort of cycle inevitably have short-term goals, but social issues rarely have short-term solutions. They generally require long-term sustained attempts to address the problem. And so how do we move policing away from the current dynamic where it becomes so enveloped in political dynamics that it can't actually put its hand to long-term solutions or attempts?
So how you get it enacted and what our goals are obviously two separate steps. So the way I think you do it is I go to 3 methods, and I'm not convinced that there's any other methods that are reasonable. So the first method is a mayor or county executive, however your jurisdiction words it, that is willing to give up power of their enforcement wing because they recognize that that's for the people and that's a better long-term goal, and that, hey, maybe you don't even want to run the police department. Why don't you put it on us? That way nobody can even protest. Like, if the citizens are in charge of the police department, who's going to protest the police department? The citizens? That doesn't even make any sense. So if you can, the mayor can really by shedding that responsibility, will improve their own condition by not even taking the hits of police malpractice, because that's now all of our problem because we're controlling it. But that mayor, to do that, I mean, it takes a lot to say, I'm going to make a dramatic step and fight to give up the enforcement wing of the things that have traditionally gotten mayors elected, which is reducing crime. Like in the city of Baltimore, you reduce the crime by a whole bunch, you're going to get reelected. So if you do this, like, there's no face that is doing this, so you don't have like a confidence to say this will lower crime. Like, I can explain it to you, I can tell you with complete confidence it will, but no one's seen it happen, so they're not going to have courage to go about it. It will take somebody with extreme ethical and moral determination. The second method would be for us to just wait. And I think we are in a battle societally between the people who have adapted to and integrated with the age of technology and the people who refuse to integrate into the age of technology. So I really think that those people who understand the truth, you find a bunch of people that are 40 and under, to generalize who's in the age of information, and they're against the drug war, they understand police brutality, they get that state-sanctioned agents shouldn't be raiding people's houses over minor offenses. So this is something that education solves, and the age of information is very good at least spreading education around. And in that case, we're going to have to wait until millennials and Gen Xers that are the majority of the age of information before they're in power and can do things differently. Places like Google and Facebook are great examples of companies living in the age of technology, and publishers and music industries are great examples of industries not living in the age of technology. And we can see how that butts up, and that happens in policing in our broader society. So that's just waiting. I think it's inevitable anyway, because all the science supports that way, and eventually enough scientists are going to be there, and that's the way you go. The third option is the realistic option, that this is a radical revolution compared to the norm. So if you look at a textbook and you look at where things like this have worked before, like ending the drug war works everywhere you do it. I mean, it worked here with alcohol. So you know that these things work. It's just that no one actually does it and pushes the issue forward, which means that the people are going to have to stand up and they're going to have to fight, and civil disobedience continues until there's no more time for civility because enough people have been on the other side of equations. You get enough Tamir Rices, and eventually all society has to give in and say that's enough, and you're going to get a radical revolution, which means burnt buildings and people on the streets and things like that. I mean, that's just a gross truth that throughout the history of the world, revolutions like that don't take place without violence. It's happened here on our own soil time and time again.
So let me just ask, with respect to the stakeholder model that you've talked about, with where the relationship between the community and the police is involved, how do you sort of see police leaders being chosen, and for how long in a system like that? And the process, how does the process of determining goals sort of play out?
So if people want to look at my model, I do have the basic idea of the model and how you implement it as a pinned tweet on my Twitter page. But see, the thing is what's special about the model is all that stuff gets fine-tuned for your individual jurisdiction. So what I do is I use a Delphi-type method of interviewing in depth with all the stakeholders. So you get all the stakeholders, and then you interview with them individually, and you keep refining what policing will look like to that jurisdiction, because that's the fundamental question, is what do you want your police to be? The time of me telling you what police will be is over. So all I can ever do is argue what position I will argue with that jurisdiction. But if they don't agree with me, then it's my responsibility, as if I were the CEO, the police executive, to carry out what they want. My opinion at that point in time wouldn't matter. I would have to be a manager and do what they want. So how I think that goes is that has to be a civilian, because we're working for civilians now. And one of the key components is to separate policing from all these checks and balances from a civilian side. So you break up the agency so that there's an actual police side led by police, and then there's the administrative side led by civilians. So what we do now in policing is, like in Baltimore, Beefield was a CEO of a major corporation. Fred Beefield, former
police commissioner
of Baltimore. Right. So this guy, the way it's structured now, these are corporations essentially, and you had an individual who was a cop who ended up being the CEO of a major corporation with a GED. This can't happen. So this is how we get into these traps of being pawns. So can somebody with a GED be a political pawn? Yeah, pretty easy. So what we have to do is have trained civilian managers, is what I would argue for in that position, because what their job is to lay out metrics and incentives and implement managerial reforms and argue with the police commissioner, a head sworn officer, about those things and how they're going to carry it out and whatever the details of that are. But fundamentally, you have to have somebody that's been trained and has the education of a CEO, because it's a major corporation you're trying to run there. And how long that lasts, I really don't think it matters. It could end up being a more permanent position, because what cycles is the board. It doesn't have to be the CEO that cycles, and probably shouldn't be the CEO that cycles, because the CEO is going to be very much of public face. So that's the person that does the interviews. Like, for instance, I try to embody what that would be. So if you think that stakeholders, means all stakeholders, that means ex-convicts, that means your Black Lives Matter parade, that means your Freddie Gray. So you need somebody that has earned the trust of those stakeholders and can meet in privacy and go over those things with all the people of the city. And that will take a long time and will be something that you need to keep developing. And once they trust that individual, they're going to have a hard time breaking from somebody that's earned such a role within the city.
I guess the question to my mind then becomes, how do you sort of deal with the inevitable problem posed by what is essentially a democratic process that you're describing in terms of reaching out to the various different types of stakeholders, which is, I think, as we've mentioned in the past, different populations in the same neighborhood feel very differently about certain issues or activities or, whatever the case may be. And the police are often then sort of pushed and pulled, right, in various directions at once, where you have certain people who feel afraid, and so they want you to come and bring the hammer. And then you have those who feel like the hammer is itself the problem. How does that person sort of navigate that effectively without sort of ending up in the same place that we currently do in terms of the way the police become political pawns? And is part of it simply just changing the culture where we don't think of police simply as people we order to go do something, but think of, say, the civilian administrator as someone who is in a dialogue with us, not simply about what the goals need to be, but what effective policing and law enforcement practice looks like?
Yeah, I see these things as holistic and needing to be holistic. One of the results of the government collapse in El Salvador recently was that they were able, when they reconstructed the government, a lot of scientists were able to go in and kind of really re-envision how government should work and watch how El Salvador formed and see what happened. And one of the conclusions was that everything has to be taken from a holistic perspective. All of the agencies in a city have to integrate and work with one another to kind of feed the whole system. And so the check and balance I have for the problem you're presenting is that if there's a 7-member board, then 4 of those members come from the most heavily policed or impoverished neighborhoods. So you're always weighted to whoever gets the most police service directed at. And that will create a system. So if you're in Baltimore and it's weighted towards Freddie Gray's neighborhood, well, the civilians there, they don't want their children chased down the way Freddie Gray is. And that means that we also won't chase down the children in Roland Park that way, which we weren't going to do anyway. So I think what I mean by holistic there then is that if whoever you are defining as the weakest among your society has the majority of influence on policing, then you give the entire city or the entire jurisdiction an incentive to educate and improve the weakest among us.
And then in light of establishing a system like that, how do you sort of protect against the tendency where, right, like the people who are from our poorest communities, let's say taking the school system, for example, right? Like when parents from our poorest communities go and advocate for their children, they often find themselves in a situation, that is not very sort of balanced in terms of dealing with an administrator who might have a sort of high level of educational attainment, knows all of like the sort of, buzzwords of the education field. So they just kind of like talk over you and talk past you. And, you feel like you're trying to advocate for your child. And in a lot of instances, you might be absolutely correct, but this person's kind of able to walk over you. And, the reality is in our most distressed neighborhoods is that a lot of our residents haven't received the highest level of education. They've been limited in terms of their work experience or other avenues by which they might attain knowledge by any number of factors. And so how do we sort of address the potential in those situations where like you might have those 4 board members out of the 7 being from this community, but there's sometimes a tendency to sort of view those persons, just because of the way we view these things socially anyway, as sort of less, and therefore their perspective is sort of weighted less. Will simply having the weight of the board tilted in that direction be enough to address that issue?
I don't think it would be. I think it's a part. So, that's the role of people like me to try and correct that on that small avenue right there. But the change that I would argue for ultimately is that we have to use our police officers to fight the causes of crime. So the causes of crime, if we investigate, so if somebody commits a robbery, I want to investigate not the details of the crime and how we're going to incarcerate the person. That's a part of it. But what should be the main focus is what conditions and things led up to this robbery taking place. So the things that we have seen so far in literature that contribute to crime, environmental poisoning is probably the leading one, but you have other things like poverty, you have lack of education, you have lack of opportunity, you have all these other issues. So those are going to be the same issues that lead to problems with potential problems with maybe those 4 board members that it's weighted towards. So if we're fighting those things as a police department, we're literally fighting that as an agency at the very same time. I view that if we see that the lack of education is a contributing factor to committing crimes, then police have to take the lead on fighting for better education. And that might only be a bully pulpit, but I have a bully pulpit. And for the things that I couldn't do, then that's what the bully pulpit is for. I got to say, look, that we're not educating the individuals in our society. That's leading to them being in situations that force them to commit crime. And that's where we need to direct our resources from public health and from social sciences. And if you don't want to do it, then we take it out of the police budget, because that's actually focusing on a cause of crime. We have to do maybe a more preventive medicine idea would be a way to look at this. If we can fight all the things. So the reason the kid is on the corner slinging dope is because he can't go and work a regular job. Well, if we put our money and efforts towards getting him a regular job and getting him education, getting him identity projects and setting up identity project things within the police department itself, then we are on a cycle to fix those things. So it's not about being perfect. It's about being completely adaptable as these new things come. So I don't want a system that's focused, like, say we do educate all those people and we don't have that problem anymore, but we don't want to sit there and go, now what do we do? We need to have a system that keeps looking. So maybe those problems linger for a while, but we're at least going in the right direction, whereas now we know we're going in the wrong direction.
I mean, it's interesting, especially in light of, trying to think about this problem holistically, as you talked about earlier. Is there an extent to which, especially in light of the fact that, like you said, at one point we had a CEO whose educational attainment was just a high school equivalency, right? And that's not to sort of demean that level of high school education. We all have sort of different opportunities to be educated, and we all take sort of different career paths in life. But it does sort of raise some flags, particularly in light of the important social role police play. And equally on the other side, you often have a citizenry that, certainly in a place like Baltimore, if it went through the public school system, did not receive an adequate education, even if they completed high school. And that is equipped with that sort of limited education and asked to vet the different perspectives in our political or police arenas on how best to address really complicated social issues. Is there an extent to which simply improving overall the educational structure in our society would help both the civilian side of that equation and the police side of the equation?
I don't know. Instinctively, I want to say yes, but that's going back to my criminal justice degree. I don't think really taught me anything other than what not to do. So I'm very leery of it. So even take Bats, who had a PhD in criminal justice related field. That's great. You're great at being a cop. We did not address the fact that you're a manager of a major corporation. So it's not that their education on being how to be a cop is one thing, and something we can probably elevate and improve on a separate issue. But then being trained to be a manager and to run an actual business or entity of any sort is an entirely different skill set. So we have to not think of looking at who runs police as police. That doesn't work. You don't want a farmer who understands how to pick corn. You don't want him doing the GPS logistics of how you harvest it. That's a different skill set. So, while we continue to improve education all the way around, there's some element of it having to be the right education for the right role. Almost the education in who goes in what role is more important than how they actually do that role.
Would that be equally true then of civilians who might be playing an oversight role of the police, that we might want to expect that they have a certain background that prepares them for that role specifically? Or is being a citizen in and of itself enough of a frame of reference to effectively know what that should be?
No, I think they should have a training course in order to be part of the board. What that would look like, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, we'd have to think about each jurisdiction that's going to have to be fine-tuned to, and how they do it, and how much funding they have, things like that. But what we want to get people just the idea of like this conversation. So the idea that we're having is to create a system that continues to help us, and we're looking to solve the causes of crime, not problems of crime. I really think that, as you were saying about your background and talking to people in so-called inner cities or ghettos or anything, they do know these things. I just patently dismiss that they don't know what they're observing and what they want. And it just takes somebody who's trained in management and in maybe even just science itself and how to get to conclusions and how to figure things out, but more specifically management science. And you can argue these things and say, okay, well, if you don't want these things to occur in your neighborhood, then let's look at how we can go about doing that. I want to have professors in there. I want to have a big college program. So all that requires more nuance in how we do those details. But the idea is for this to be open. So it's not like some closed thing where a board member can want something that's ridiculous. There's going to be professors in there. There's going to be there's going to be people from their area other than them. There's going to be activists. There's going to be this is like a group discussion. It's just that those 7 people get to say this is the direction that we will go in for our police agency, and they're just a stand-in for that community as a whole.